want to ask you this morning, I know this to be true because for most of my life, I've either read or been hearing the Bible read to me. And I know that some of its words, particularly those with which we are most familiar, sometimes sort of go past us. Hear these words from Matthew's gospel. Hear them as if we are hearing them perhaps for the first time. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give them your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, even as your heavenly Father in heaven is perfect. May God bless the reading and the hearing of this word. May God's Spirit come among us to enable to live the truth of these words. Well, friends, the theme continues in Matthew's gospel, suggesting that it is a still speaking God whom we worship. Jesus continues to speak what must have been revolutionary words to some and discomforting words to many who were comfortable with the way things were. When Jesus uttered once again, you have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said in your ancient and sacred text, but I say to you. You have heard it said by your teachers and by the generations who have gone before you, but I say to you. You have heard it said with so much certitude by the pontificators of your day, but I say to you. You have heard it said, and you move about your lives as if new perspective is an impossibility, but I say to you. Before we consider what it is that Jesus said, I want to offer you a contemporary rendering, a writing of this same God is still speaking idea. I want you to think this morning, and I'm going to join you in the same thinking about all the things we have simply accepted in terms of reality, in terms of what is and always shall be, to think about the things in our world, in our community, in our church, in our families, in our own lives that we have accepted as fixed and static and unchangeable. And just as important as the particular truth of this passage is Jesus' continued insistence that we rethink what is fixed and static and unchangeable, and to open ourselves to new possibilities for our living and our living together. Well, here is that contemporary approach inspired by these very words of Jesus from a poet named Christopher Burkett. You have heard that it was said, charity begins at home, your care confined by what you know. But I say to you, love is not bound. It stretches your will, enlarging your soul, confounding constraint. For if you care alone for those who are near, what have you learned but to subsist? You have heard it was said, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Your learning of life dulled by your age. But I say to you, the tree grows until its dying day. Living is always learning. For if you know only yesterday's answer, where will you meet the risen Christ anew? You have heard it was said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Your imagination held tight by what is. But I say to you, a better way there may be. What's comfortable can be a sham. How things are excludes too much. For if you let what is be all that there is, where do you see the kingdom's changing call? You have heard it was said, blood is thicker than water. Ties of birth determine who's kin. But I say to you, kin is belonging that's given by God. Ties that bind are as wide as sovereign grace. For if you make your clan soul affinity, where then is God's plan for exclusion that heals? You've heard that it was said, but I say to you, there is more to us together than we have yet seen. In Matthew's gospel today, we remain in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and we might say that in these verses, Jesus gets to the very heart of the matter. The very passage which I read this morning, which speaks to a love so far-reaching in nature that it extends to one's enemies, was once the subject of a speaker who was speaking in, of all places, the National Prayer Breakfast. Harvard professor Arthur Brooks surprised his audience when he spoke with great directness at an event known for inviting speakers who knew full well that they were to tread lightly. He wasn't treading lightly when he defined America's greatest crisis, and these are his words, as a culture of contempt that is tearing our society apart. He continued by reading the call from Matthew's gospel to love one's enemies. And he followed that up with this short commentary. Love your enemies. Now that's thinking differently. It changed the world starting 2,000 years ago, and it is as subversive and counterintuitive today as it was then. But the devil's in the details. How do we do it in a country and a world roiled by political hatred and differences that we can't seem to bridge? End quote. What a profound question he proposed to America's leaders, to American citizens who stand on two sides of a seemingly unbridgeable aisle. Well, as fate would have it, the speaker who followed Dr. Brooks was none other than the president and now former president of the United States, who addressed the audience, and Dr. Brooks in particular, by saying, "I'm not sure that I believe you." Now, I feel compelled to ease any anxiety that I might be causing in this pregnant gap between bringing politics into a religious service And this gap between what I might do when I approach that line, which most often separates the two. Let me just say it's going to be okay, I promise. See, my friends and supporters and those who wish me to succeed might well be saying, don't do it, Phil. Don't step over that line. Stephanie, my lovely wife, who even as I'm speaking is probably listening to our service, driving to her last yoga teacher training class, and is probably thinking, don't do it, honey. I can't make enough teaching yoga to support us both. And then there's that imaginary world where there are people who don't like me. Stretch your imaginations with me here. They're probably saying, go ahead and do it. Step over that line and see what happens. Well, what I'm about to say might surprise you. It surprises me a little bit. If I could speak to that former president about his expressed skepticism regarding the radical nature of Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, I would say, thank you for saying that out loud. Because those of us who live and move in the Christian church, we need to talk about some of those doubts because we carry them and bear them in our own hearts. Turn the other cheek. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, turn the other cheek. How many times do I turn the other cheek before I've created the environment where a bully finds space to continue their abusive behavior? There's a question. How many times do I turn the other cheek before I turn my hurt and my anger inward upon myself, thereby propelling myself into victimhood and depression? Turn the other cheek. How many times do we preachers stand in places just like this, preaching this doctrine, before we unwittingly create a caste system of people stuck in abusive relationships who now believe their plight is somehow endorsed by the church? You see, some questions. There's some things we need to talk about if we're going to live in the truth of Jesus' teachings. Give to everyone who begs from you, Jesus taught. How do we do that in a world where we know that for every real need, there's a scam intended to fleece the giver? But then there's the clincher. The pinnacle of this passage, and perhaps the pinnacle of the Sermon on the Mount, and I would go one step further and say this is perhaps the highest ground to which Jesus ever calls us. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, and pray for those who persecute you. How are we to do that in a world where our enemies at best want to silence us and at worst want to silence us once and for all? How in the world are we mortals, flesh and blood, flawed, breakable people? How are we to do these things? How in the world are we to scale this mountain to which Jesus calls us and to stand on that high ground? How? I've spoken this morning of a line that one must approach with great caution. But I believe that Jesus' teaching on this day is taking us to another line. But in this case, we are being implored to step across it. Of all that is astounding about this text, nothing is more astounding than the very last verse. Be perfect, Jesus said, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Perfect. You can't see my notes, but there's like 5 question marks after perfect. Perfect? I don't know about you, but I think they've got the wrong guy in me. An important note. The root of the word perfect, which Matthew uses in this text, is the Greek telos. And yes, it can be translated perfect, but better meanings capture its essence are completion, intended goal, determined end. Jesus, I believe, means for us to take these words very seriously, but he isn't calling us toward perfection in the moral sense. He isn't calling us to infallibility, but rather towards God's intention for us as human beings and us as human beings living together. Dr. King's words come back to me once more, even though I quoted the same words last week. They remind us that it isn't important where we are or how many times we have failed in the living out of these powerful truths. What matters is that we keep moving forward toward the divine intention for our lives and for the lives that we live together. Remember his words, if you can't fly and I can't, then run. And if you can't run, and my knees won't let me do much of that anymore either, then let's walk. And if you can't walk, then crawl. But keep moving forward. In all of this, Jesus has led us up to a line. And on one side of that line is all that we can accomplish through our efforts, through our determination, through our perseverance. And there's a lot that we can do by trying hard and picking ourselves up by our bootstraps when we fall. And I think that we can do a lot with our own gifts and our own ingenuity. Yes, we can do a lot, but we cannot reach the heights to which Jesus has called us. We can't achieve a love that reaches that far. We can't achieve a love that reaches that high. I only know that to get there, we have to cross a line. We must step across a line from what we can do on our own and into a space where we can discover what we can only do with God's help. And with the graceful movement of the Spirit in our lives. Into stepping over that line into that space where we encounter an ever-creating Creator. And where we ask that Creator to create anew in us. During Black History Month, we have been reminded that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. But it doesn't bend toward justice simply because we want it to, or even because we work hard for it. It bends toward justice because that is God's intention for the universe and for our lives. This teaching of Jesus is vitally important, not only because of what it calls us to do, but because of what it reminds us we can't do on our own. And in it, there is an invitation to step over that line where we meet an end of our own capacity to love, and where we allow the Spirit of perfect love, which is at the heart of the universe, to empower us and to enable us to love in a way that is beyond us. To love with a strength we don't have on our own. To pardon with a divinely provided bounty, which is beyond any resource we could ever dream of possessing. To embrace even our enemy with a form of compassion which can only be cultivated by the Spirit of the living Christ living in us and moving about among us. Some lines are danger signals, imploring us to stay on the other side. But some lines, my friends, are meant to be crossed. Let's cross this one together. Amen.